All stand for the commissioners. Tēnā koa e noho, please be seated. Kua haere anō tēnei nohoanga. The sitting is resumed.
Mr. Merrick.
Our next witness today is Alison Green. Tēnā koe, Alison. Nau mai hara mai ki tēnei. Tēnei kaupapa. Nau nei raka tēnei te mihi nui ki a koe. Tō mahi whakahira-hira I tēnei rā. So just welcome and acknowledge you for being here and for the work that's been done to get to this point.
And can I insert a requirement of the Inquiries Act to ask you to solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you'll give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I confirm that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Merrick.
Sir, may I have permission just to approach Ms. Green to
Certainly.
put her microphone on? Thank you. Well, just by way of introduction, Dr. Green, ko wai koe no hea koe, so if you can tell us who you are and where you're from.
Tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā koutou ngā mema o te komihana matua, nei rā te mihi. Kia koe Chris, tēnā anō hoki koe, kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou. Ko Alison Green ahau, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Awa, no Ngāti Rangi Nui.
Tēnā koe. By way of further introduction, you've outlined in your brief of evidence some of your qualifications. And in 2018, did you complete a PhD in Maori and Indigenous Development?
I did.
From the University of Waikato. Can you tell us more about what that was about, what the thesis was?
Can I just go back a bit though,
Sure.
Chris? I'd like to say that that I'm a mother of 3 grown children, 2 of whom have recently had their first babies, and I'm raising my 14-year-old grandson who was removed from his mother's care 10.5 years ago. So that's important context for me. So I have a PhD in Maori and Indigenous Development. I researched and compared Indigenous knowledge in health legislation and policy in New Zealand and Canada. And I'm also currently the inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the University of Saskatchewan. And in that capacity, I'm researching alongside a Cree professor from the University of Saskatchewan. We're comparing the removal of Indigenous children in both polities.
And do I understand it that postgraduate fellowship or postdoctoral, fellowship will effectively travel alongside the life of this commission?
Yes, it will. That's right.
At paragraph 4, you outline some of the work that you're doing for Ngāti Awa. Can you tell us about that?
So I'm currently the chair of the Ngāti Awa Community Development Trust. So we look into the issues of social development, so health, housing, education, community development in general, as well as the development and maintenance of our reo and our tikanga for Ngāti Awa. But I have also done a couple of pieces of work for the tribe, and so I, in 2007, spent time working for Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa, looking at the co-production of social policy, and that was that was an interesting piece of work. So again, we were looking at how we as an iwi might influence legislation and policy, in particular social policy, so that those worked well for our people, whereas historically they haven't, and of course that's been the domain of the Crown and not Maori. And the other piece of work that I did, which is somewhat touches on the work of the Commission, or the brief of this Commission, was looking into offending and victimisation involving Māori, both as offenders but also as victims in the Mātātua region. So I was looking at how those statistics, at why Mātātua were overrepresented in those negative statistics. And that report was peer-reviewed by Professor Tracy McIntosh, who will be with the Commission in a few days.
And just for those who aren't familiar, for those that aren't familiar, the Mātātua region, Te Rohio Mātātua, can you just explain that for us?
So that region would cover what is called the Bay of Plenty region, so right up the coast, and then down into the bowl around the Tauranga area.
Kia ora. You come to it later in your brief, but we acknowledge it up front. At this stage is a piece of work that you did in 1992 for the Human Rights Commission. Can you just briefly tell us about that piece of work? We'll go into detail later on.
So in 1992, I co-researched and authored a report with Pānia Alison. The report was titled "Who Cares for the Kids? A Study of Children and Young People in Out of Family Care." And the report was done in two sections. So there's a Maori section, and then there's a Tauiwi or Pākehā section. And Pānia and I did the Maori section, which we can talk about later.
Yes, and it was the Human Rights Commission that commissioned that report at that time?
That's right, it was.
Now, turning back to your brief, and we're on page 2 now. We're still on page 1, and really I did want to ask you about two things. First is your involvement in claims before the Waitangi Tribunal. Can you tell us about your involvement in that tribunal?
So I am party to a claim, that's claim 2494, and we've recently, and I'm party to that claim because my whānau have experienced 3 generations of removal involving Department of Social Welfare, then the Child, Youth and Family Services, and most recently Oranga Tamariki. In my statement of claim, I'm concerned at 2 levels. I'm concerned about the factors which predispose some Māori families to the removal of their children at rates that are far higher than those than our population would suggest. And the second aspect is that is the way in which the removals happen, and in particular, those removals happen as an arranged that they happen without the involvement of hapu and the whānau more generally. Thank you. And can I add, Chris, that we've just been advised that particular claim and 2 others will be heard with urgency, and I think that speaks to the critical issues that children, Maori children, are facing right now. So although it's valuable to have this broader, the scope of the tribunal, I think it's also important that we consider the rights of Maori children now.
We're on page 2 now, and I suppose as a starting point for you to share with us your experience in going into in being removed from your whānau. At paragraph 6 of your brief, you start to talk about that, and if you could start to share with us from that point would be great. Thank you.
So I am the eldest of 7 children. I was born in 1958, and I was removed soon after birth and raised by Pākehā parents. My parents who raised me were recent immigrants to New Zealand. And the consequence of, so I was adopted under the 1955 Adoption Act, and it was a closed adoption, and as a consequence of that I was separated from my whakapapa, whenua and whānau, and those had traumatic consequences for me through my early life, and I'd say they still have consequences. They do.
Did you come to learn some more about the circumstances of you being born and then adopted? Mm-hmm. What could you tell us about that today?
So I was adopted, and around about 10 days after I was born, I was taken by my adopting parents to the far north. They told me later that they were advised by the social worker to say that I had a touch of Spanish, and that my birth parents no longer wanted me. And I was told by them that there was no way that I could, by my parents, this is my adopting parents, that I was unable to make contact with my birth parents. In fact, I'm really uncomfortable using those terms, birth parent and adopting parents. I think those are, the terms themselves are probably precursors as well to, or probably justification for removal through the closed adoption process. The idea that you can be a birth parent, but that parenting and that relationship can end at birth, and then you can pick up with somebody else. So yes, my parents, with my birth mother, so my birth mother was Pākehā, father Maori. My father and my father and mother met at a dance in Tauranga. They dated for around about 8 months, and then she became pregnant, and out of the stigma that accompanied what was called pregnancies out of wedlock in those days, she went to Auckland to her parents, where she was persuaded both by social welfare but also I think by her mother that it was in her best interests and mine that I be given up for adoption. She had been told by the social welfare that if I was able to live my life as a Pākehā child, or certainly not as a Maori child, that my outcomes would be better. And so I guess the touch of Spanish kind of accounted somewhat for the fact that I was a small, brown, round, dark-haired child, and they needed some way to account for that.
Are you aware of the practice at the time of establishing a hierarchy in terms of the adoption system?
Yes.
And do you have any comment about that and how that, on reflection, has impacted on you in your circumstances?
So my adopting parents told me that they had been, because they were recent British immigrants to New Zealand, that they were given the bad babies and the hard-to-place babies. And the bad babies were the Maori babies, and the hard-to-place babies, in the case of my adoptive sister, who was Pākehā, were babies that were not expected to live. And that was her situation. In fact, she did live, but that was the hierarchy as it was explained to them.
At paragraph 9, you've made reference to growing up in Aotearoa without whakapapa whenua and whānau. I'd like us to unpack that a little bit in your own circumstances. And as a starting point for that, can I ask you how societal attitudes of that time, much like what I'd describe as a racist hierarchy of adoption system, how that impacted on you growing up across the board, schooling, and that sort of thing in terms of your identity? Yeah.
I want to liken this to my experience to the Pipi Wharauroa. So the Pipi Wharauroa is a migrant bird, the shining cuckoo, and it migrates from the Bismarck archipelago, so from Papua New Guinea and Melanesia. In spring, it migrates to New Zealand, and it looks for the nest of the riro, or the grey warbler, and it lays its egg in that nest, and then it flies off, and the riro raises the Pipi Wharauroa chick, and then, but here's the rub, and here's the Maori understanding of the situation, is that the Pipi Wharauroa is always a Pipi Wharauroa. The Pipi Wharauroa does not become the riro. And so for me, I was raised in a nest by Pākehā parents, but I remained myself. And there is a sense, no, it's more than a sense, there is a belief in this country that when children are removed and raised by somebody else, that they will become somebody else. I can tell you that is not so. But what you're left with are remnants of who you could be and who you would be had you been raised in the environment, in the nest that you should have been, that you belong to. And so I had very unusual. I had an unusual childhood in that I knew that I was adopted, and I knew that I didn't belong in this nest and that I belonged somewhere else. And that journey of finding out where I came from and where I belonged was a lifelong journey. And, you know, so that requires, it requires a lot of hard work on my part, not to lose focus of who I was meant to be, and importantly, the original instructions of my people for their people and for us going forward. So, so without those original instructions, which I'll talk about later, Chris, but without those, it's hard to find a path. You don't really, the path doesn't open up naturally for you. So in order to reach one's potential happens much later, I think, than if the child is raised where it belongs, in the whānau, in the hapu, and with the iwi. So things like, so I know now, for example, you know, when I go to my home territories, there is a feeling about standing on those lands, about seeing, looking through my eyes at the view that my tupuna would have seen. Those are powerful feelings that I wasn't able to access during the early years of my life, and only later when the Adult Adoption Information Act 1985 came into being, and then I could begin that journey back.
And so, looking at that journey back, what did the Adult Adoption Information Act 1985 allow you to do? What happened from there for you?
Yes. So before that, I'd approached social welfare on at least 2 occasions and asked if I could be given even non-identifying information, but information that would allow me to say, in answer to the question, no hea koe, I could say, no tauranga ahau, no whakatāne ahau. And that would be at least some sort of toehold into that journey of belonging, but I was refused on both occasions. So finally, when the legislation changed, I think, you know, fairly well forward in the queue of people writing to social welfare to ask for my file. And it was my good fortune that my birth mother hadn't heard about the legislation, and so hadn't had an opportunity to prevent access to the file. I don't know whether she would have. I'm unsure about that, but certainly it made it much easier. So that happened in 1985. I think in 1987, might have been, that I first spoke to her. And as we corresponded first, and then we talked on the telephone, and she was able to provide me with the information that I needed. And we had contact with each other for a period of time, but she experienced post-traumatic stress syndrome at my separation, related to the adoption. She was having flashbacks and panic attacks, so we stopped further communication. But I found out that she had another child after me to a Maori man, and she kept that child despite the pressure to give him up. And for her, that was a healing point for her.
And so, do I have my math right? I always get it wrong. By that stage, you're 21 or around 21 years of age before you've had that opportunity to access that information.
Yes.
Yeah. And prior to that, you've been denied that.
Yes, I was. So I moved from Epsom Girls Grammar, where I did my secondary schooling, and I got there through a Maori Affairs scholarship, and in a boarding school, and then went to Victoria University and did a degree in Te Reo Māori and anthropology. And of course, you know, it was, this was the days of the, following the Land March, and a general Māori sort of an uprising of Māori across the country. And so, you know, we were concerned that the Crown had not honoured the Treaty of Waitangi and of course Te Tiriti o Waitangi, most importantly. And so I was involved in Māori activities all through my university undergraduate degree. And the question was asked of me all the time, no hea koe? And I didn't have the answer as an 18-year-old student. And for that reason, Professor Hirani Moko-Mead and his wife made a tremendous offer to whāngai me in order to provide some sort of resolution, albeit temporary, to that trauma of being removed and not having whakapapa and whānau and whenua.
So, can we turn now to ki tō taha Māori, tō pāpā, to your dad's side. Tell us about exploring that avenue and finding out about that side of yourself.
Yes. So when I found out the name Mason, I immediately contacted my professor, Hirani Moko-Mead, and said to him naively, do you know the Mason whānau from Tauranga? And he said to me, well, actually, they're from Whakatane, but there are some Masons in Tauranga. And he said, actually, your koro sits in the office next to me. He's the general manager, he's the whakapapa expert, he's the person you need to talk to. And so it was this, this is, I think, where the Pākehā Western world, with its objectivities and its focus on what can be seen and what can be measured and described, and the Māori world separate. So the fact that Professor Mead had come to me and made this offer, the fact that we were already closely related but didn't know, to me was evidence of those things that are unseen, which for us are as important, if not more so, than what can be seen and described. The rest of my years have been spent building the relationships that I wasn't able to build as a child, as a young person growing up with my whānau. My aunties, so my father's sisters and brother, were so generous, so welcoming of me as the eldest child of my father, who had passed by the time I went back into the family. But their generosity of spirit on my Ngāti Ranginui side and on my Ngāti Awa side was so reassuring and grounding for me.
Spoken about the importance of the unseen, and then you've also just mentioned the passing of your father, and you've talked about it in your brief. He kōrero au mō tēnā, have you got some things to say about that aspect of your brief?
Well,
your kōrero, your story, your life?
Yeah. So as soon as I knew, but to go back, when my father passed, he passed a few kilometres from where I was at boarding school, and I knew he'd passed. Don't ask me how, but it was there. And as have been many other things that have happened since then. Sorry, Chris, I've lost my place. Yeah.
One of the things that you've talked about in your brief is the extent to which you've, through your father's connection, learnt about the whakapapa of your whānau. And if I can describe it as the breadth and depth of it.
Yeah.
And that's described at page 3 of your brief. In particular, you've talked about some of your tūpuna, some of your ancestors.
Yes.
Can you tell us why you chose to include them in your brief of evidence and in your kōrero for us today?
So anyone who knows anything about whakapapa would know how tricky it is to come to understand the different lines of your whakapapa. So you would choose, so if you were talking about your whakapapa and you were in a particular area of the country, you might use another line of your whakapapa than you might were you at home. And that's in order to indicate the relationships that your tūpuna have with the people of the land upon which you're standing. So I wanted to show that it takes a number of years to amass that information. You gather it from people who are respected in your whānau, and I was very lucky on my Ngāti Awa side, so that's my grandfather's side, to have Koro Joe Mason as the source of my information. And of course, it's always useful to go to the Native Land Court minutes to read about one's tūpuna. And then on my grandmother's side, which is my Ngāti Ranginui side, my father's youngest sister, Te Iwi Pearson, gave me that whakapapa. But the other point of having the whakapapa in my brief of evidence was to highlight for today anyway, two members of my two tūpuna who were well respected and well known in my tribal areas. So Te Mono Tāhuna on my Ngāti Ranginui side was a composer of waiata, and to this day Ngāti Ranginui sing and perform the waiata that she wrote for her illegitimate daughter, Matatu Monotahuna, and she wrote that. The term illegitimate is a Western term. For whatever reason, Monotahuna didn't name the father of her child. But she wrote this waiata to celebrate her, the absolute adoration that she had for her daughter. And my new mokopuna, so my eldest daughter's child, she has named her Matatu, after Matatu Monotahuna. So on my Ranginui side, we have Monotahuna. On my Ngāti side, I've referred to Pauawha Meihana, my great-great-great-grandfather. His statue stands on our marae. He was his claims and his counterclaims are through the Native Land Court minute books from the period from the 1880s. He was a stalwart and a forthright defender of te mana o Ngāti Awa me te mana o Ngāti Pūkeko. So that was my tūpuna, and it absolutely horrifies me that from the 1970s onwards, the state saw fit to remove 3 generations of children from whānau of respected tūpuna. And so that is the point of having that information in there, to provide that contrast.
We're going to head in that direction shortly, but before we move away from our kōrero about whakapapa, I wondered if you had any comment about, given the time that you were effectively disallowed to live in that whakapapa, to really experience it, and now having learned all of that, if you had any reflection about the lived experience of being part of that wealth, of cultural wealth and whānau wealth, whanaungatanga, compared to having to come in later and learn about it and experience it later in life. Have you got any reflections on that?
Well, of course, the whakapapa is, as Rawiri said this morning, it is relationships. And so while I have the words here and the names, some of the richness can never be retrieved. You know, I wasn't party to conversations, to events, to tribal gatherings where people were regularly talking about the deeds of our tūpuna. So I've come to that much later in life, and that's something that cannot be regained. And for that reason, I have made it pretty much my life journey to make sure that my children and my mokopuna, so the children of my siblings and their children, that they never experience what I went through. Because although I went through it in a closed adoption system, effectively those who have been removed by the state from the 1970s and 80s onwards are also experiencing that poverty of relationship connected to whakapapa.
We are now at paragraph 16 of your brief of evidence. And Can you share with us your thoughts about the impact of colonisation within your whānau hapuiwi context?
Yes. So on my Ngāti Ranginui and Ngāti Awa side, there are the reports to the Waitangi Tribunal that document the confiscation, the raupatu, of thousands of acres of land that both of my iwi experienced, and the effects of that in a socio-economic sense, but also in terms of the lack of political authority or mana within our region. So those breaches, so the tribunal found for the claimants, so for both tribes, and were very clear with the Crown that they had breached Articles 2 and 3 had breached Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And so I'm alleging, and I will do this in my claim to the Waitangi Tribunal, that breach of Te Tiriti has extended, that the Crown has seen itself as able to breach the Te Tiriti o Waitangi in relation to the removal of our children. So the Crown has seen itself as having the right to remove our children, either through closed adoption or through uplift and placement in uplift, and that view is a breach, I believe, of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And of course, Te Pua o Te Atatu, and this is an original copy of the document, recommendations 1 and 2, which I can talk about later, but certainly highlight the right under Te Tiriti o Waitangi of Maori to care for and raise our taonga, our children, ourselves, within our authorities. So I'd also like to comment on the part that racism has played in my adoption, but also in the removal of my nieces and nephews and grandchildren. So it seems to me that there's a shameful silence in this country, that those of us who've been removed from our families under the adoption legislation, that we have laboured under that shameful silence, and in fact we have adopted that silence ourselves. That there has been very little about the impact of closed adoption on Māori children, on the loss to hapu and iwi, and that to me speaks to racism in this country. I think that if the same were happening for tauiwi, that there would be a public outcry, both about the removal of children by Oranga Tamariki, but also the closed adoption system and the loss of potential of children to Pākehā families. But because we are Māori, that has happened with very little interruption until recently.
And so when you say tauiwi, you mean non-Māori in that context? In your brief of evidence from paragraph 18, you talk about some factors that you would argue have created whānau vulnerability to child removal.
Yes.
in your summary, what are some of those factors in the context of your whānau, your hapu iwi?
So years and years of legislation and policy and poor practice across the whole range of social and economic and political, across those spheres, have the cumulative effect of that, part of which is dealt with in the Waitangi Tribunal reports, but the more recent material has not been dealt with. But it is that legislation, policy and practice across the social, economic and political spheres that have reduced some Maori families to the point where we are extremely vulnerable to the removal of our children. This didn't happen overnight. My nieces and nephews who've had their children removed, they were not in a position where they were, where they had assets and resources as part of their daily lives, knew where they were from, well grounded in their tikanga and reo. They did not suddenly find themselves with oranga tamariki knocking on their door. They themselves were removed from my siblings who were removed from their families. And the poverty, so poverty, addiction, living in neighbourhoods with where there's high levels of crime and violence. Those, so most recently, the availability of methamphetamine. These are the antecedents to removal of children. But it didn't happen overnight. It happened, successive governments allowed the situation to come to this point. And that is the point that my nieces and nephews and my grandchildren find themselves in today.
What you've begun to touch on there is the move from the papakainga to the cities, or from the rural, the home base to the cities. And at paragraph 24 of your brief of evidence, you've touched on that in terms of your earlier kōrero about the loss of land
Yes.
in your home.
Yes.
So,
and can I read? So in 1891, Pope described the lands of Ngai Tamarawaho, that's Ngāti Ranginui, as little in quantity and poor in quality. These natives live a miserable existence at Huria, endeavouring to get some return for their ungrateful glebe, or working precariously for neighbouring Europeans, or working out their constitutions on the gum fields. So that is a report about my hapu Ngai Tamarawaho in 1891. Things were that bad. We've had, nearly 200 years of legislation and policy, and that poverty has been further entrenched.
Coming back to your siblings, you've discussed their entry into the state care system from paragraph 27 of your brief of evidence. Can we pick up from that point?
So my after my father died, he died at 32 years of age. And suddenly, after he died, my children's mother made the decision to leave the Papakainga at Huria, Ngai Tamarawaho lands, and take my siblings with her to Wellington. She moved for work reasons, but without the support of whānau, of elders, people who knew not just the negative things about ourselves as was written in 1891, but also the strong and positive things. Without that, my siblings, my sisters and brothers, faced many, many challenges. And to the extent of being put into homes and foster care. And through that separation from our homelands, although they are fiercely proud of being from Tauranga and of being Maori, the specifics around whakapapa and whenua and whānau in its Maori sense, not just mum and dad, but whānau in a Maori sense, that information has not been available to them. And so that, in combination with poverty and a school system that failed all but one, failed 5 out of 6, their lives, the trajectory of their lives was set for real difficulties. And I've made the point in my brief of evidence, that this was a time when New Zealand was experiencing its good years. This was the Pavlova paradise. We were not part of that. That is racism. So the culture and relationships of gang life, addiction, poverty, became constant features of my sisters and brothers' lives, and those have remained.
Now, I'll just turn to the chair now because we're pretty close to 1 o'clock, sir.
Yes, I think that might be a convenient moment for us to take an adjournment. The stenographer has been in full action for a lengthy time. So, Dr. Green, if you don't mind, we will take an adjournment now and we'll return to your evidence at 2:15.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Registrar.
Kua heke tēnei nohoanga, tēnā koe e tū. The sitting is adjourned, all stand.